Our learning target for this session is to introduce you to the basic components of the Web IEP Goals page, commonly referred to as the D page. We will discuss what information is required to be entered on this page of the IEP and how to develop quality, monitorable, measurable, and meaningful goals. The goals pages are used to document the information about the student's present level of academic achievement and functional performance, which is specific to each goal. It is also used to document the goal and the methods that will be used to evaluate progress on the goal. This includes the student's current functioning information, baseline data, the goal, progress monitoring procedures including a decision-making rule, positions responsible for monitoring the goal, milestones or short-term objectives, and options for reporting progress. The goals page also includes an essential graphing component used to determine whether the student is responding to instruction. The purpose of goal writing is to meet the student's needs that are resulting from their disability, and also to enable the student to successfully participate in and make progress in the general education curriculum. This page also provides a system for measuring progress towards long-range expectations. And of special note, goals always should be aligned to the Iowa Core curriculum. When you open the Goals tab, the first thing you must do is add a new goal. Determine what the goal area is and the domain that is being evaluated. This decision should be based on what a student is not able to demonstrate, which requires specialized instruction and what instruction you will be providing. Current academic achievement and functional performance data are related to the goal area and instruction that you'll be providing for the student. This data will guide your instruction. It should include relevant evaluation information from the initial or most recent evaluation, district-wide assessments, and it should also include current performance in comparison to general education peers and standards, which are indication of the functional expectations in the environments where the individual skills need to be performed. Relevant information must directly relate to the goal area and be recent enough to merit consideration in developing this particular goal. Remember to include the student's results on the most recent evaluation and district-wide assessments relevant to the goal. Also include current performance in comparison to general education peers and standards and the student's functional performance in the goal area. Gathering data to drive instruction and the development of a quality IEP goal should be informed through a process called RIOT. RIOT refers to a process that teams can use to gather quality data. This includes reviewing existing information that may already be available to the team. Many times this includes district-wide assessment, universal screening data, progress monitoring data, previous IEP goals, and it also includes diagnostic information that may be available from the general education. Interviewing is also very important. This process helps us gather critical pieces of information from parents, students, teachers, and other important caregivers. It's also important to observe the student during instruction, both when they are having difficulty and not having difficulty. Finally, the last component of RIOT is testing. This is a diagnostic process to help teams identify specific skills that students need to be taught in order to access the general education curriculum. The RIOT process helps to inform the team around critical elements that are important for the development of that student's IEP. RIOT informs ISIL. ISIL includes instruction, which is how we deliver content to the student. Curriculum is what specific skills and behaviors we're going to teach the student explicitly. Environment includes the conditions that may inhibit or excel a student's learning. Many times, through the development of an IEP, accommodations are developed around what environmental modifications the student may need. And finally, learning supports are also a critical community connection and connection to parents. These are other supports that may be needed for the learner to access the general education curriculum. So in summary, ISIL, which is instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner, is informed through the RIOT process, which is reviewing information, interviewing key stakeholders, observing the student during instruction, and also doing diagnostic assessment to find out what specific skills the student needs. Please take a moment to look at this table. and consider the content of assessment domains. Look at instruction, curriculum, environment, and learning supports, and consider how this information informs the development of a quality IEP goal. There are different ways we collect data when we use functional assessment. We can review existing information, interview, observe, or use testing information. So, think for a moment about the data that you use to develop instructional plans and determine student needs. Where would the majority of your assessments be included under different components of Riot? Now, do you have a comprehensive understanding of the student's needs using multiple measurement strategies? When determining student needs, it's important to have multiple sources of data that converge for appropriate decision making. The current academic achievement and functional performance, also referred to as PLAF, will be the first and foundational component by which all IEP goals will be established. The PLAF is where the results of the initial or most recent evaluation and the results of district-wide assessments relevant to the goal are described. Performance in comparison to general education peers and to the Iowa Early Learning Standards or Iowa Core Standards also need to be indicated. The Iowa Early Learning Standards and the Iowa Core Essential Skills can be accessed by clicking on the question mark above the PLAF portion of the goal page. The PLAF documents the data the team used to determine a student's instructional goal and establish a basis for the need for specialized instruction. The information in this section must directly relate to the goal area. It must also be recent enough to merit consideration in developing this particular goal. Here you will see some stems for writing the current academic achievement and functional performance, where you will indicate using specific data what the student can and cannot do, how they can apply and generalize information, and also comparing them to peers or other established standards. Let's look at some examples of the current academic achievement and functional performance section for various age and grade groups. We'll give you a moment to examine each example. Of special note, you may want to end the PLAF section with data that will be compared to the baseline. This will make it easier for the reader of the IEP to follow the progression of items on the goals page. Here is an example of a preschool PLAF. Here is an example of an elementary PLAF. Here is an example of a middle school PLAF. And finally, here's an example of a high school PLAF. The baseline section must describe the student's current performance in measurable terms. It must be aligned with the content of the PLAF, B page, and also the information provided in the current functioning section. You'll need to select a measure or probing assessment that is directly related to the skill and instruction being provided for each goal area. The baseline is the student's current performance on the indicator that will be used to monitor progress towards the goal. The measurement tool should be the same tool used to monitor progress. It should be stable, reliable, and be equivalent each time it is administered. The selection of a tool that can be administered or used to monitor behavior without test-retest effects over time is necessary. Measures should be short, easily administered, and informative. Generally, this is a curriculum-based measure, rubric, or a behavior checklist. It is measured in the same way as the goal. It must be observable, measurable, and specific. The baseline must include a number. Here is an example of a preschool and elementary baseline. The baseline section must describe the student's current performance in measurable terms. The baseline will be used to measure progress towards the goal. and it must align with the information on page B and the information provided in the current functioning section. Measurable annual goals need to be aligned with baseline data. There needs to be at least one goal for each area of need. Goals should represent an ambitious and realistic one-year accomplishment. Goals need to address needs identified in the present levels of academic and functional performance. Goals need to be clear and understandable. Also, goals need to be practical and relevant. They also need to be positively stated. The purpose of the goal page is to further focus the team in a systematic way. There is a direct relationship between the goal and the student's results. Prioritization is a key concept. The IEP goals are the areas that the IEP team determines are most essential and require progress monitoring. This is not meant to limit the curriculum, but rather to direct the IEP services focus. So a tricky question often comes up. How many goals should there be? Is there such thing as having too many goals? This is a question to consider amongst the IEP team. You may want to consider the so what test with the number of goals. If teams have questions about their prioritization, they should be considering what it might mean if the student were able to do all of the goals. How would it be functionally relevant? And if the student is 13 or older, what impact would it have on living, learning, and working? Measurable annual goals must be written in the same measurable terms as the baseline. The goal must include a time frame, conditions, behavior, and a criteria. The time frame is the length of time the student will be given to meet the goal. Conditions include the circumstances under which the individual will perform. And a behavior should describe what the individual will do. The criterion will include the acceptable level of performance. So, for example, in 36 weeks, given a 4th grade level reading passage, Kirsten will read 100 words per minute with 95% decoding accuracy. Goals should represent an ambitious and realistic one-year accomplishment. Goals should be positively stated. So instead of saying, in 36 weeks, Johnny will stop a behavior, you may want to indicate in 36 weeks which alternative replacement positive behaviors you would like to see Johnny demonstrating. Here is a template for writing goals. As you can see, we have a time frame in 36 weeks. There's also a condition. Bobby will be given an 8th grade reading passage and 1 minute to orally read. There's also a behavior indicated. He will read. There's finally a criteria of performance. We want Bobby to read 140 correct words per minute. It's important to take note that students who have living, learning, and working transition plans on page B of the IEP due to the student turning 13 during the academic year, or who have already turned 14, will need to be sure that they have alignment between the secondary expectations checked on page B and the goals that are developed. Here are some tips that you might want to use for setting goals. You want to think about what goal can be set to tell the team whether the student is making accelerated progress and whether the supports are appropriate. When setting goals for acceleration, always use a standard of appropriate comparison. If we don't have a target we're aiming for, it's difficult to know if we're approaching appropriate performance. And it's also difficult to adjust instruction appropriately using progress monitoring data when goals are not based on sound data. Some options teams may use to consider appropriate standards would be using research-based performance levels or norms, such as Dibble's Next benchmarks, early learning standards, curriculum-based measurement standards, college-level entrance expectations, also using research growth rates, peer performance, and other locally developed norms are also appropriate. Appropriate goals allow us to compare student progress to an expectation. It is important to ensure we are setting solid, ambitious goals for students in each goal area. Without setting ambitious goals, we are unlikely to close the gap for students. We know that struggling students' rate of progress needs to be steeper than that of the typical student's rate of progress. When we consider decision-making, We need to not only consider the decision-making rule that's chosen, but also the goal that's set. Without ambitious and appropriate goals, our efforts at decision-making are somewhat limited. What would you decide regarding a student's progress given these graphs? First, consider the student's first graph, and then consider the student's second graph. What would you decide regarding a student's progress given these two graphs? These are the same data, just represented differently in each picture. The only thing that's changed is the goal. The standard you choose greatly affects your goal and the progress that you'll expect. These two pictures show how goals affect interpretation. When we look at the graph progress, we assume that the goal that was set was appropriate. However, without good knowledge of how to set an appropriate goal, we may or may not be making good decisions when we use these data. The progress monitoring procedures are the methods for measuring progress towards the goal. It includes the following: a method for measuring progress, or the how, frequency that progress will be measured, so how often, and the decision-making rule for instructional changes, for example, a 4-point decision-making rule or trend line analysis. The baseline and goal criteria must have the same numeric measurement, and the progress monitoring must correspond to that measurement for appropriate progress monitoring. Progress monitoring through curriculum-based measures, or CBMs, are widely used in a variety of contexts. These might include RTI efforts, or, in special education, monitoring short and long-term goals. CBM is used to monitor student progress across a 36-week timetable. Students are given standardized probes at regular intervals, including weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly, to produce accurate and meaningful results that teachers can use to quantify short and long-term student learning gains. Curriculum-based measures are designed to address a variety of problems and to progress monitor. In addition, behavior and social skills are also monitored in a similar manner using rubrics, observation tools, checklists, and also classroom PBIS data. It is extremely important that the PLAF, baseline, and progress monitoring procedures align. Here are some examples of good and bad alignment. When developing a student's goal, it's important to also consider how the goal will be continued to be monitored over the next year. If there are a limited number of assessments available, it would not be wise to select that assessment as the baseline and progress monitoring method. Consider alternative assessments or measures that can be given throughout the year and which will align with the student's PLAF. Following the collection of progress data, you are ready to ask questions and make decisions about how well the plan is working. Formative evaluation occurs throughout the implementation of intervention and instruction. The purpose of evaluating the intervention during implementation is to determine the likely success of the intervention so that it can be modified or changed if needed to increase the likelihood that the goal will be met. The application of a progress monitoring strategy is critical to interpreting the student's learning data. So there are two strategies of visual analysis that are commonly used and are research-based that are predictive in their ability. These are the 4-point decision-making rule and trendline analysis. Both strategies require visual analysis of progress data. Decision rules can be used two ways. These decision rules are based on the student's trend line. If the student's trend line is steeper than the goal line, the student's end-of-year performance goals need to be increased. If the student's trend line is flatter than the goal line, the teacher needs to revise the instructional program. And if the student's trend line and goal line are the same, no changes need to be made. When a student's trend line does not cross the aim line or goal line of a student's graph, it is indicating that the student will not meet their goal and an instructional change is necessary. The application of a trendline analysis should only be followed and used after collecting a minimum of 7 consecutive data points. The second way a decision-making rule can be applied is through a 4-point decision-making analysis. These decision rules are based on the most recent 4 consecutive scores following the collection of at least 7 data points. So, if the most recent 4 consecutive CBM scores are above the goal line, the student's end-of-year performance goal needs to be increased. If the most recent 4 consecutive CBM scores are below the goal line, the teacher needs to revise the instructional program. Look at this graph. The most recent 4 consecutive CBM scores are above the goal line, so the teacher needs to increase the student's end-of-year performance goal. The teacher increases the desired rate or goal to boost the actual rate of student performance. The point of the goal increase is noted on the graph as a dotted vertical line. This allows teachers to visually note when the student's goal was changed. The teacher reevaluates the student graph in another 7 to 8 data points to determine whether the student's new goal is appropriate or whether a teaching strategy change is needed. On this graph, the most recent 4 scores are below the goal line. Therefore, the teacher needs to change the student's instructional program. The end-of-year performance goal and goal line never decrease. They can only increase. The instructional program should be tailored to bring a student's scores up so that they match or surpass the goal line. The teacher draws a solid vertical line when making an instructional change. This allows the teacher to visually note when changes to the student's instructional program were made. The teacher then reevaluates the student's graph in another 7 to 8 data points to determine whether the change was effective. Here is an example of preschool and elementary progress monitoring procedures. Progress monitoring procedures include the frequency of measurement and the decision-making rule for instructional changes. A rule of thumb for academic data collection is about once a week, while behavior data collection is daily. The baseline and goal criterion must have the same numeric measurement, and the progress monitoring procedures must correspond to that measurement. On the goals page of the Web IEP, select the person's name and it will autofill the position. When the IEP is printed, only the positions will be displayed. Only the position or title is listed in the Positions Responsible for Services section when the IEP is printed. If 2 people are collaborating, the additional person's title should be included. Major milestones are required for students taking the alternative assessment. Major milestones are not required for all students. Consider using major milestones when students are significantly behind their peers and are unable to participate in district-wide assessment. Student progress towards the attainment of the IEP goals should be assessed regularly and frequently. Regularly means using a measurement equivalent to the one used to establish the baseline score. Frequently means often enough to allow for good instructional decision-making. To make a statistically sound initial decision about the effectiveness of the chosen instructional strategy, 7 to 9 data points must be available. Once you have 7 to 9 data points, you may use either trendline analysis or the 4-point decision-making rule. The intent of graphing helps us to create a picture of the student's learning, and it also helps us predict their learning rate. Graphing allows for communication and decision-making, while also providing us documentation of student learning. Graphing also makes data easier to interpret. Graph data are easier to interpret than data displayed in a table. Graphing is one of the most powerful pieces of a student's IEP. It allows you as a teacher to understand whether instruction, support, or accommodations are improving the student's performance, or is it helping to facilitate skill acquisition. It also helps us to know whether it will lead and tell the team members whether the student is closing the gap between themselves and their peers. It's important that every student's progress monitoring assessment be entered as soon as a student takes the progress monitoring assessment into the Web IEP system so that the data can be interpreted. A graph or chart creates a picture of a student's learning rate. That picture is created and makes data easier to interpret and communicate. It also provides for decision making, predicting of learning, and documentation. Let's take a brief moment to look at the graphing system in the Web IEP.
You will select the Goals tab, and you will notice off to the right there is a Graphs section. There's a pull-down menu that states Choose. If there's a graph already created, it will have a number and then the title of the graph. If you select that, there will be an option to load the graph and also an X if you wanted to delete the graph. If you select Load, it will load the graph setup page so that you can update progress monitoring. To go back to the Goals overview, you will select the Goals tab. You now have the ability to add multiple graphs to a particular goal. You can do this by selecting New from the pull-down and Load. And you will need to enter minimal information in order to start entering your data entry points. So you will need to enter a y-axis label, so we'll call this Reading Comprehension. You will need a minimum and maximum y-score. We'll do 0 to 100. The dates will automatically fill in from tab A. You will need to enter a starting and ending point for your aim line. So we'll do 5 to 40. Peer line is optional. Legend text, you will need to enter data set A, so we'll do words per minute. You will notice that there's an all phase change score. The first score of new phase automatically defaults, but you have the ability to change that to last score of old phase. You will notice that there are 5 blank lines for you to enter your data. So if we were to enter on line 1 by choosing the date, and then you can enter your first data point. You have the ability to select baseline, comment, and if you do select comment, you'll notice from the pull down for comment or phase line that those are not grayed out, where phase change only is grayed out. Now if you were to select phase line, phase changes will show and can be selected. Monitoring log comments, you can enter comments that you feel are necessary. You also have the ability off on the right-hand side to delete any data scores that you wish to. There is a save at the bottom of the tab. There's also a print if you wanted to print. And if you select print, you'll notice there is a monitoring log option there. If you select forms, that will print the monitoring log. And if we click Show Queue, it's going to show the graph, and then it will also show the monitoring log. You can click on Close and then Cancel to get out of those screens. You also have the ability to select Save in Graph, which will show you the graph that you're currently on. You can close out of that at the right top. Go back to your Goals tab, and now you'll notice from the graph pull down that there is more than one graph for that particular goal. That concludes the Graph and Graph Setup section.
The Web IEP graph will aid in the visual interpretation of progress monitoring data and graphing the collection of reliable and stable data. The system will allow you to accurately reflect when the baseline data was collected, which may be prior to the start date of the IEP. For instance, if your IEP duration is September 1st, 2013 to August 31st of 2014, you can manually set the graph to run from August of 2013 to August of 2014. The graph duration can be a maximum of 395 days. You can then include baseline data points collected in August prior to the beginning of the IEP which in this case is September 1st. Teachers will manually mark the final pre-IEP score as a baseline score. All data collected prior to the marked baseline data point will be separated visually on the graph from the progress monitoring data collected beginning with the start date of the IEP. The graph setup screen contains data fields. It also has helper links that give the definition of certain graph elements. Some items are required, while many are not. This screen collects information which determines how the graph is generated and what is included on the graph. All items on the graph setup area above goal results are required, with the exception of pure line values. The Web IEP graphing features include the graph baseline and duration, which can reflect dates used to collect baseline information and extends the duration of the graph to 395 days in total. The trend line automatically configures based on 7 data points. Phase line changes have become standardized, and decision-making prompts are a feature designed to assist teachers and IEP teams in making data-based decisions. We will now describe some of the required and non-required fields in the graphing setup. The first required field is the y-axis or vertical label. This describes the units of measurement, for example, in percent correct or words correct per minute. The second required field is the y-axis scores. These are the top and bottom numbers for the vertical scale on your graph and what the interval will be between those scores. For example, with percent correct, you most likely would choose a score of 1 to 100 with an interval of 10. Keep in mind the scale must be broad enough to encompass the aim line starting and ending points. The third required field is the starting date, which might be the IEP meeting date, and ending date might be 1 year from your IEP meeting date. The fourth required field is the aim line starting and ending points. The aim line shows the expected rate of progress that a student needs to make in order to accomplish their goal. The starting point would most likely be the baseline score, and the ending point would most likely be their goal score. The final required field is the legend text for data set A. This describes what is being measured. For example, words per minute or comprehension questions. An optional field is the legend text for data set B. If you do choose to graph 2 sets of data on the same graph, this is where your second set of data would go. We will now talk about entering your progress monitoring data. Each time you progress monitor a student, you will be required to enter that score into the progress monitoring table. The fields that are required are the date the assessment was administered and the student's score. Your table will also be required to have at least one baseline. As you progress with progress monitoring, it may be necessary to indicate when decisions were made which required instructional changes, which will be considered phase lines, or when the team had discussions and made decisions where no instructional changes are needed, which will be indicated through comments. After setting the graph duration for up to 395 days, you can easily and accurately indicate when baseline data were collected. You can enter all baseline scores collected, which in this case occurred on August 24th, 26th, and the 31st. In this example, the final data point was selected to represent the baseline. The standard procedure is to pick the median or middle data value as your baseline data point. All data collected prior to the marked baseline data point will be separated visually on the graph from the progress monitoring data collected beginning with the start date of the IEP. You can select or choose to make a comment or phase change several times over the course of the IEP. A comment indicates that you have reviewed the data and you are commenting on the student's progress and program. A phase change occurs when data analysis indicates a change is necessary and the phase line represents a change has been made to the instructional program or services. You can see in this screenshot, when you enter data for a student, you can make a comment or a phase change. When you click the comment or phase line box, you will see a drop-down menu appear. Responses appropriate for a phase change will be available for selection when the phase line box is checked. Similarly, when the comment box is checked, responses appropriate for comments will be available. As you can see, some of the comment options are related to breaks in school, student absences, medication changes, and one of the options you will likely use most frequently is that of data reviewed, no change. Here you will see that some of the options in the drop-down menu are indicated as a comment or a phase change. These items include instructional materials change, teacher and student ratio increased, and teacher and student ratio decreased. When making a selection between comment or phase change, you must consider the purpose of the note. Are you simply noting a comment that will assist in visual interpretation of the data, or is a change being made to the program which would be a phase change? You would make a comment when you want to make a note about the student's program to assist in data analysis, but you are not viewing it as a phase change. Remember, a phase change is a significant change in instructional materials, procedures, strategies, teacher and student ratio, or time made for the purpose of increasing the student's rate of progress. The comment line does not restart the trend line calculation or break the line connecting the data points. A phase change does restart the trend line calculation and begins a new data set to represent the new phase of instruction. As you can see in this student's graph, using 4-point decision-making rules, the teacher collected 6 to 8 data points over at least 3 weeks and then analyzed the final 4 data points. Kate is making adequate progress, and the teacher added a comment in late November that indicates data was reviewed and no change was necessary. As the school year continues for Kate and her teacher, we can see that another comment has been added to the graph. In this case, the teacher-student ratio was increased. The comment was made when the teacher was documenting that 2 additional students had joined the small group of specially designed reading instruction. The graph illustrates that comments do not recalculate the trend line or break the line connecting data points within the dataset. Kate's instruction continues until January. The teacher has been using the 4-point decision-making rule and at this point recognizes that Kate's most recent 4 data points are below the goal line. Using all of the information and data available for Kate, the teacher decides to make a phase change, which is a significant change to Kate's program. Data indicates an appropriate change to Kate's program is to decrease the student-teacher ratio. The teacher has selected a phase change, and you can see the notes indicate the change has been made. Additionally, you can see after the phase change, the data sets are not connected. You can see the visual phase line in yellow, as well as the separation of the 2 phases of data in this graph. The first phase is circled in red, and the second phase of data after the instructional change has occurred is circled in green. The phase line indicates an instructional change or prolonged interruption. Click the check box and indicate a description of the change. The graph will recalculate the trend line and restart the count of data points. A trend line will appear after 7 consecutive data points are entered into the system with no longer than 30 days between a single data point. Trendline analysis will assist you in interpreting whether the instruction was being effective and eliminating the achievement gap. The trend line is pink on this graph, and for our purposes was marked with an arrow to show you this function. In addition to the trend line, the teacher will receive a 4-point advance or update. The graph screen will display advice for teachers in bold red text if the most recent 4 consecutive points within the current phase are above or below the aim line. This will only appear in the web display. It will not appear on the printed graph. It is important to continue analyzing the last 4 data points each time you gather additional progress monitoring information. Unfortunately, here we see Tyler's progress decline and the last 4 data points are falling below the goal line. The Web IEP graphing system actually senses this and puts a sentence at the top of your graph in red indicating a 4 point are below the goal line and that you should be considering an instructional change. At this point, you would consider what the data is telling you about the student. What information do you have regarding the types of errors that this student is making with which you can conduct an error analysis? What do you know about the environment in which this student receives instruction? Do they have adequate opportunities to respond, to receive corrective feedback? Do they have adequate practice opportunities? And does the student require a shift in instructional focus or a shift in instructional time or grouping? You must consider all of the information you know about the student to make an appropriate instructional change. This will be visually marked on the graph with a phase line. In this case, the teacher has decided to make an instructional or procedural change. You can see this visually appears on the graph in the form of a dotted phase line paired with the note instructional procedure or strategy change. This is an example of a completed graph. There are notes indicating each component of the graph. These notes are not indicated on the Web IEP system and are intended only for interpretation purposes as part of this training. Congratulations! You've completed the content related to the goals page of the IEP, commonly referred to as page D. Please continue to the next module at your convenience.